The sky has always been our oldest book, but not everyone learned to read it the same way. Long before telescopes, satellites, or modern science, there were people who watched the heavens with an intensity that bordered on obsession. To them, the sky was not just decoration. It was a living map of patterns, cycles, and warnings. They believed the movements of the stars, the rhythm of the planets, and the timing of eclipses carried messages about what was coming for the world below. And what makes this belief unsettling is not that they looked to the sky for meaning. It's that, again and again, their predictions seemed to line up with moments of real catastrophe. Across ancient ruins scattered over distant lands, carvings appear that do not match simple star maps. They are not just constellations. They are sequences. Timelines carved into stone, where celestial alignments are paired with symbols of destruction, flooding, fire, and collapse. The official explanation is that these were symbolic or religious. But when these carvings are compared across sites that had no known contact, they follow eerily similar patterns. The same rare sky events are paired with the same types of disaster imagery. This consistency hints at a shared system of interpretation, as if these civilizations were not just observing the sky, but tracking long-term cycles they believed governed the fate of the world. Imagine living in a time when the sky was the most reliable record you had. No written calendars, no global timekeeping, no instruments to store long-term data. The stars become your memory. The slow dance of the heavens becomes your clock. Over generations, patterns emerge. Certain alignments coincide with droughts. Certain cycles line up with earthquakes or massive storms. At first, these links may seem coincidental. But when the same sky patterns precede destruction again and again across centuries, coincidence begins to feel like pattern recognition. And pattern recognition is the foundation of science, even when wrapped in myth. The civilization behind these sky patterns appears to have been deeply invested in long-term observation. Not years. Not decades. Centuries. This alone suggests an advanced cultural structure that valued knowledge preservation across generations. Someone had to record the sky. Someone had to compare it with events on Earth. Someone had to pass this knowledge forward. This is not casual stargazing. This is institutional memory written in stone, ritual, and architecture. What makes this even more unsettling is that their structures themselves appear aligned with specific celestial events. Not just solstices and equinoxes, which many cultures tracked, but rarer cycles involving planetary groupings and long-period sky patterns that repeat over many decades. These alignments are not useful for agriculture alone. They are too infrequent to matter for planting crops. Their purpose seems to have been ceremonial or predictive, as if these sites were built to mark moments when the sky was believed to signal danger. The question, then, is whether this civilization merely believed the sky caused catastrophes, or whether they had discovered correlations that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Today, we know that solar activity can affect climate patterns. We know that asteroid impacts, solar storms, and long-term orbital cycles can influence Earth stability. But ancient sky watchers did not have physics. They had patterns. They watched the heavens and watched the Earth suffer, and they connected the two through memory and myth. Over time, this knowledge appears to have been encoded into stories of gods growing angry, of celestial serpents devouring the sun, of stars falling from the sky to punish humanity. These myths may not be fantasy in the way we think. They may be symbolic language for real, observed cycles of destruction. When the sky changed in specific ways, disaster followed often enough to become legend. This changes how we should read ancient catastrophe myths. Instead of asking whether these stories are true or false, we might ask what patterns of observation they are preserving. Myths are not data sheets. They are compressed memory. They take generations of experience and condense it into symbols that can survive even when technical knowledge fades. A civilization that predicted catastrophes through sky patterns may not have understood the mechanics of space. But they may have understood timing. And timing is everything when it comes to survival. What makes this story even more haunting is that this civilization eventually vanished. The sky watchers, the record keepers, the interpreters of patterns, they are gone. Their monuments remain. Their symbols remain. But the full system of understanding has fractured. We are left with fragments of a language we no longer speak, staring at a sky we still watch, yet rarely with the same long memory. If a society once existed that could anticipate periods of catastrophe by reading the heavens, then the most dangerous loss was not their fall, but the loss of their warnings. Because the sky has not stopped moving. The cycles have not ended. We may simply no longer know what they once knew about when the sky means trouble. Once the possibility of intentional sky-based prediction is taken seriously, the remains of this civilization begin to look less like religious relics and more like components of a long-term warning system. Their monuments appear positioned not just for visibility, but for timing. Certain structures align with rare celestial groupings that only occur once in several generations. These alignments would have been meaningless for daily life. They were not useful for farming schedules or navigation. Their only purpose seems to have been remembrance. A way to mark when the sky returned to a configuration associated with past destruction. This implies a level of patience and cultural continuity that is difficult to imagine today. A prediction system that spans centuries is not designed for the individual. It is designed for the future. Someone had to care enough about events they would never personally witness to ensure the pattern was preserved. That kind of thinking suggests a civilization deeply aware of long-term cycles, one that did not see history as a straight line of progress, but as a repeating rhythm of stability and collapse. Their skywatchers were not fortune-tellers. They were archivists of catastrophe. Knowledge like this cannot survive casually. It requires ritual, repetition, and institutional protection. The patterns of the sky would have been taught to apprentices, embedded into ceremonies, and reinforced through architecture. Each generation would inherit not only the ability to observe, but the responsibility to remember. Over time, the original reasons for certain alignments may have faded, but the actions remained. People gathered when the stars formed certain shapes. They feared eclipses not because they thought monsters ate the sun, but because eclipses had coincided with terrible events in the distant past. The myth preserved the emotional truth of the data even as the technical meaning blurred. This system of memory also explains why different regions developed similar sky myths without direct contact. If large-scale natural disasters affected multiple parts of the world around the same time, the same sky events would have been visible everywhere. Different cultures could independently associate the same celestial patterns with destruction. Over generations, these independent observations would converge into similar myths. The sky becomes a shared calendar of trauma, written above every civilization regardless of language. Eventually, however, such systems become fragile. When societies grow comfortable, the urgency of remembering catastrophe fades. Knowledge tied to fear is often dismissed when fear seems unnecessary. Sky watchers become priests. Priests become symbols. Symbols become rituals performed without understanding. At that point, the system is still alive in form, but dead in function. People repeat the actions but forget why the actions mattered. The pattern remains carved in stone, but its interpretation dissolves into superstition. Then comes collapse. Wars, climate shifts, or internal decay break the chain of transmission. The last generation that understood the sky patterns dies. The monuments remain, but they are no longer read correctly. The alignments still occur, but no one remembers what they once signaled. The warning system fails not because the sky changes, but because human memory does. This is where the story turns from ancient mystery to modern relevance. Today, we have instruments that watch the sky more precisely than any ancient civilization could. We track solar cycles, near-Earth objects, cosmic radiation, and long-term orbital changes. But our relationship with the sky is different. It is technical, fragmented across institutions, and often disconnected from cultural memory. If a warning comes from space, it is handled by specialists, not embedded into collective consciousness. The ancient system, flawed as it was, wove cosmic risk into daily life and shared belief. Our system isolates it into data that most people never see. The unsettling possibility is that the ancient civilization did not need to understand astrophysics to recognize danger. They only needed enough time to notice patterns. We, with all our technology, may be blind to certain long-term rhythms because our attention is short. We watch the sky constantly, but we do not always remember it across generations in ways that shape culture. In that sense, the ancient sky watchers may have been less advanced in tools, but more advanced in memory. As researchers attempt to decode what this civilization was truly tracking, the sky patterns begin to look less mystical and more mathematical. Certain carvings and alignments repeat in intervals that match long-term celestial cycles rather than daily or seasonal ones. These are not the obvious rhythms of sunrise and harvest. They correspond to rare configurations that take decades, sometimes generations, to repeat. This alone implies that the civilization was not simply reacting to disasters after they occurred. They were anticipating windows of heightened risk. The sky was not seen as a cause in itself, but as a clock that marked when the world became unstable. Over centuries, patterns emerge when enough time is observed. Long solar cycles subtly influence climate, rainfall, and temperature. Periods of increased solar activity can stress Earth's magnetic field, intensify storms, and disrupt environmental stability. Ancient observers would not have known the physics behind these forces, but they could see their effects. Years of abnormal weather cluster around certain periods. Crops fail more often when the sky follows particular rhythms. Unusual celestial events, like comets or intense meteor showers, coincide with years of fear and disruption. The human mind is designed to detect patterns, especially when survival is at stake. Over time, these patterns harden into predictive frameworks. The more disturbing possibility is that the civilization was not just tracking slow cycles, but sudden threats as well. Large impacts from space are rare, but they leave scars on Earth that can be remembered for generations. A single catastrophic event, like a massive impact or extreme solar storm, could traumatize a culture deeply enough that the sky configuration of that moment becomes sacred, feared, and remembered. Over time, descendants learn that when the heavens return to a similar configuration, the world is at risk. The original scientific cause may be forgotten, but the association remains. The sky becomes a trigger for cultural memory of disaster. This explains why certain celestial alignments are carved alongside imagery of floods, fire from the sky, darkness, and trembling ground. These symbols are not random decorations. They are compressed records of catastrophe. A flood may not have been caused by the stars, but the flood and the stars were observed together often enough to be linked in memory. The civilization was not claiming the sky caused the disaster. They were marking when disaster happened in relation to the sky. In a world without precise calendars or long-term written archives, the heavens become the most stable reference frame available. Mountains erode. Cities fall. The sky repeats. What makes this system more convincing is that the alignments associated with catastrophe are not common ones. They are rare. The civilization did not mark every full moon or seasonal shift with destruction imagery. They singled out specific, infrequent patterns. This selectivity suggests intentional filtering rather than superstition. If everything in the sky were treated as a sign of danger, the system would be useless. By focusing on rare events, they preserved a signal within the noise of daily celestial motion. This is the logic of early data science, encoded in myth. Knowledge of these cycles would have been dangerous to mishandle. Predicting catastrophe creates fear. Fear can destabilize societies if it is not managed carefully. This may be why the information was embedded in ritual and symbolism rather than raw prediction. The people were not told, a disaster will happen in exactly this year. They were told, when the sky returns to this form, the world becomes dangerous. This creates preparedness without precise panic. It allows societies to increase caution, store resources, reinforce structures, or avoid risky behavior during periods believed to be unstable. Over time, however, this cautious system may have created its own problems. Generations that lived through predicted danger without experiencing catastrophe would begin to doubt the system. Skepticism grows when warnings do not immediately come true. Eventually, the predictive tradition becomes viewed as outdated belief. When that happens, societies stop preparing during risky cycles. Ironically, this is when catastrophe becomes most devastating, because the memory of preparation has been lost. The system fails not because it was wrong, but because belief in it eroded during long periods of apparent safety. There is also the possibility that the Sky Watchers themselves contributed to the collapse of their civilization. A group that claims to foresee catastrophe wields enormous social power. If their predictions influence migration, construction, or governance, they shape the fate of the society. If their predictions are misinterpreted, manipulated, or politicized, they can destabilize leadership. Over time, resentment may grow toward those who claim knowledge of impending doom. When nothing happens, the Sky Watchers may be blamed for false fear. When disaster does strike, they may be blamed for not preventing it. In either case, the custodians of sky knowledge become targets during times of stress. Eventually, the institutional structure that preserved long-term sky memory collapses. Libraries burn. Temples fall. Apprentices are lost to war or famine. The knowledge fragments into stories and symbols that survive but no longer function as predictive tools. People remember that the sky once mattered. They remember that certain alignments were feared. But they no longer remember why. The system that once connected celestial cycles to earthly survival dissolves into mythology. From a modern perspective, this loss is tragic because it represents the disappearance of centuries of observational data. Even if the ancient system was imperfect, it was grounded in long-term pattern recognition. Today, scientists struggle with the same challenge: how to preserve long-term risk knowledge across generations. Climate change, asteroid risk, solar storms. These are slow-moving threats that outlast political cycles and individual lifetimes. We document them in reports, but reports are forgotten. The ancient civilization documented risk in culture itself. Their entire worldview encoded the idea that the sky could signal danger. This raises a disturbing question. If a civilization once existed that successfully embedded long-term cosmic risk into cultural memory, and that system still collapsed, what does that say about our own ability to preserve warning systems? We rely on data stored in fragile digital systems. We rely on institutions that can be dismantled in a generation. The ancient Sky Watchers carved their warnings into stone, yet even stone could not preserve the full meaning of their knowledge. The patterns remain, but the language to interpret them is fading. The story of this civilization is not just about ancient people predicting catastrophe. It is about the difficulty of transmitting risk awareness across time. The sky changes slowly. Human attention does not. A system that works for centuries can be dismissed in a few peaceful generations. When the warning system collapses, the world feels safe, until it isn't. This is the deepest tragedy of the Sky Watchers. Their greatest achievement was a long memory of danger, and their greatest failure was that memory's eventual erasure. As the Sky Watchers system weakened, something darker began to happen. The very patterns they once used to anticipate catastrophe may have coincided with the unraveling of their own society. This creates a haunting possibility that the final generations of this civilization stood beneath familiar alignments in the heavens, sensed that the old warnings were returning, yet no longer possessed the full knowledge to act on them. The sky repeated its rhythms. The people had forgotten how to listen. Archaeological layers from the last period of this culture show signs of stress. Construction slows. Maintenance of ceremonial sites declines. Symbols once carved with care become rushed and inconsistent. This suggests not sudden annihilation, but gradual breakdown. The institutions that preserved long-term memory were eroding. Priests or sky watchers who once held respected roles appear to lose influence. Ritual spaces fall into disrepair. The sky patterns still occur, but their social meaning is no longer coordinated across the population. Some groups cling to old warnings. Others dismiss them. Fragmentation sets in. This is often how knowledge systems die. Not through dramatic destruction, but through social disagreement. When a civilization can no longer agree on what knowledge matters, its ability to respond to long-term threats collapses. The Sky Watchers' predictive framework depended on shared belief and collective action. If only a few people still took the patterns seriously, the system could not function. Preparing for catastrophe requires coordinated effort. Once that coordination fails, the warning system becomes noise. There is also evidence that later cultures inherited fragments of these sky-based predictions without understanding their original purpose. The same celestial events appear in later myths, but stripped of their practical function. Alignments once associated with preparation become associated with gods, omens, or cosmic drama. The timing remains embedded in stories, but the instructions are gone. This is cultural drift, information surviving without context. The shell of knowledge remains, but the tool it once was has become decoration. This process explains why later civilizations feared eclipses, comets, and rare celestial events without knowing why. Fear persisted because memory of disaster persisted. But without the observational framework to interpret patterns, fear became generalized and sometimes irrational. The sky, once a structured warning system, turned into a stage for superstition. The predictive power was gone, but the emotional residue remained. What makes this collapse particularly tragic is that the Sky Watchers' knowledge may have been most valuable precisely when their civilization was weakest. Periods of social stress often coincide with environmental instability. Droughts, floods, and extreme weather-strained societies already near breaking points. If the ancient predictive system could have helped communities prepare for these stresses, its loss would have accelerated collapse. In that sense, the disappearance of sky-based knowledge may not just have accompanied the civilization's fall. It may have contributed to it. There is a cruel symmetry here. The civilization that dedicated itself to reading warnings from the sky failed to preserve the system that allowed it to respond to those warnings. Their greatest strength became their greatest vulnerability. When belief in long-term cycles weakened, short-term survival instincts took over. People focused on immediate threats and internal conflicts rather than distant patterns in the heavens. By the time catastrophe cycles returned, the social machinery required to respond had already broken down. This pattern mirrors modern risk blindness. We, too, struggle to act on long-term warnings when immediate concerns dominate attention. The ancient civilization's fall is not a story of ignorance. It is a story of forgetting. They did not fail to observe the sky. They failed to sustain the culture that made observation meaningful. This is the difference between data and wisdom. Data can be collected by individuals. Wisdom requires collective memory. What survived of their system was scattered into symbols, stories, and architectural alignments that later cultures could not fully decode. The sky still moved through the same patterns. The monuments still pointed to the same moments in time. But the social agreement about what to do when those moments arrived was gone. The warning system had become a monument to itself, impressive but inert. The final lesson of this civilization is not that the sky controls our fate. It is that memory controls our ability to respond to fate. The heavens may offer patterns, but patterns are only useful if societies remember how to interpret and act on them. When memory collapses, even the most carefully built warning system becomes silent. By the end of this story, the civilization that once read the sky no longer feels like a mystery wrapped in fantasy. It feels like a warning written in slow motion. Their greatest achievement was not predicting catastrophe. It was building a culture capable of remembering risk across generations. Their greatest failure was allowing that culture to fracture until the patterns in the heavens became meaningless symbols instead of living instructions. The sky did not change. The people did. What remains today are fragments of a system that once connected celestial motion to human survival. We see the alignments. We see the symbols. We see the stories of gods, serpents, floods, and fire from the heavens that appear across distant cultures. These are not random myths scattered by coincidence. They are echoes of a time when the sky was read as a long-term calendar of danger. The technical understanding behind these echoes has faded, but the emotional memory remains embedded in legend. This reframes ancient catastrophe myths not as superstition, but as data compressed into narrative. Stories were the storage medium of long memory. They survived when institutions fell. They carried warnings forward even when the reason for the warning was lost. The tragedy is that narrative alone cannot coordinate preparation. You can fear the sky without knowing how to respond to it. You can remember danger without remembering the method of survival. In the modern world, we face a similar paradox. We track cosmic threats with advanced instruments. We understand more about solar cycles, near-Earth objects, and long-term climate forces than any ancient civilization ever could. Yet our cultural memory is short. Knowledge lives in reports, databases, and specialized communities, not in shared stories that shape collective behavior. The ancient sky watchers embedded risk into culture. We embed risk into documents that most people never see. If their system collapsed despite being carved into stone and ritual, what chance do our digital warnings have of surviving centuries of social change? The ancient civilization teaches us that the true technology of survival is not tools, but memory. Not machines, but shared understanding passed forward without breaking. When that chain breaks, even the most advanced warning system becomes useless. The sky will continue its cycles whether we watch or not. Patterns will repeat whether we remember them or not. The only variable is whether future generations will recognize danger when the heavens return to familiar shapes. The ancient sky watchers built a system to answer that question. They failed to preserve it. The stones and stories they left behind are not proof of mystical powers. They are proof of how fragile long-term knowledge really is. If this story changed the way you see the sky, follow Mystery of the Ancients. The next warning humanity forgets might already be written above us, waiting for someone who still knows how to read it.